Welcome to Our More Perfect Union. I'm David Van here with the founder of Constitutional Grounds, David Oldham. For this production, I'm better understanding the U.S. Constitution for now, and I got the feeling we may get into other constitutional issues besides the federal government. But David, it's good to see you tonight. We had a great discussion, probably just cracked the container open on the federal elections. Why there is no federal elections for president.
Right. The elections for president, as we saw last time, are run by the state legislatures, aren't they?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, you in our last week's episode, you talked about how, first of all, how members of Congress get there, because Congress ultimately has to certify the election to, tell who's going to be inaugurated 2 weeks later. Okay.
Correct.
Roughly 2 weeks later. So now, just because let's say Georgia is deemed to have violated constitutional requirements on how they do their elections, and let's say they're set aside. Now, this had happened back in 1876. Am I right? That 3 states had that issue.
Correct.
And so they didn't get to seat their members of Congress, at least not initially. I don't know, if they had to go back and do their elections over. Do you remember?
Well, actually, it was their electors for the Electoral College. So they had their Electoral College results set aside, and they were not counted in the ultimate balloting. But President Grant had enough to win anyway, and so he was elected to president.
Okay, so this is not unprecedented to set aside the reports of the electors from particular states, right?
No, not at all.
Okay, good. Now, in my understanding is when you were an Oklahoma presidential elector, later on in January that year, some Democrats tried to have certain states decertified as well, right? So.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I believe that there were a few objections made come January 6th.
I recall Alabama being one of those they tried to unseat those electors. It was Democrats who had done that. And that wasn't seen as scandalous, but by God, when the Republicans did it this year, oh my God, it's insurrection. So yeah. So what I wanted to do this week was really kind of ask you, you just got done in last week's episode stating the premises, the constitutional framework. Now I'm going to ask more for kind of word pictures. How does that actually play out? So let's say that you and I happen to be sitting up in the gallery of the House of Representatives on the morning of January 6th this year. And you were just down the road from the Capitol, my understanding was. You weren't one of the bad boys beating down the doors to get in, but you were in town, right?
Oh, I was definitely in town. I'd been at a rally earlier in the day, out down in the
ellipse.
In the ellipse below the White House. Yeah. And it's just a mile from Capitol Hill and the Capitol complex. And so I was there, had stopped by the hotel, and that's when we saw the first images on TV as we were coming back from the rally and heading down toward the Capitol with everyone else.
Yeah, and that afternoon, I got a call from a mayor here in Oklahoma, Brian Hobbs, mayor of Newkirk. He was down there. He fortunately stayed outside, stayed behind the barricades, and they still try to create problems for him. But I called you that night just as curfew was happening, and that was an interesting deal. I mean, you talk about denial of constitutional rights. And you and I have talked about curfews and all that. We'll have to avoid the temptation to get into that constitutional argument.
You'd be surprised how many new adherents to the Constitution about curfews there are after that one. That ticked a lot of people off.
Yeah, but let's talk about, let's say you and I are flies on the wall up in the gallery.
Right.
And how in a perfect David Oldham constitutional world would the events inside the Capitol have played out? I'm talking not by the protesters, but by the members of Congress. How should it have been done?
Well, there is a section of statutory law, federal statutes, that actually deals with the how you can go about raising an objection. What should have happened is every single congressman should have recognized, because it's just an objective fact, that certain states ran their elections outside of the parameters allowed by their legislature.
Right.
And that happened in numerous states.
Okay.
Every single representative and senator had the duty to raise an objection about that.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we don't have fair and honest elections. We have no oversight. We have nobody to hold anybody accountable.
Yeah.
So, and if you get to the point that these things are that bad, our Declaration of Independence talks about how the king took away representative houses, but the powers that they did don't disappear. They devolve back to the people for the people to exercise in their own way. And then you get all sorts of lawless problems.
Right.
And domestic tranquility's gone out the window.
Yeah.
So the thing is that if Congress will not do their part, then it will go back to the people, and the people are gonna revamp it and make it their own way. And the elected officials in Washington will have no say about it, because it's going to be beyond anybody.
Yeah.
So what should have happened is they should have raised objections, and they should have, on January 3rd, sent home all of the people who were elected in those unlawful elections.
Well, stop here. When you said sent home, we talked about that the electors back in 1876 were not seated, or were not recognized, but Grant was able to be elected with a majority, even without them.
Correct.
Okay, now you're talking about unseating the very members of Congress.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. That's what the 14th Amendment calls for.
Okay. Now, that's not because you don't think they won, but you don't think their state operated a constitutionally just election process.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, you can't win an improper election. There is no winner. It's you gotta go back to the drawing board and redo it. Now, so you have your Congress people that have to be sent home. Well, 3 days later, after Congress is seated on the 3rd of January, you have the count of the Electoral College on the 6th. Just 3 days later.
Right.
And you got to do the same exact thing for those states, because those states, this is the accountability that they have, that they don't get representation if they are running illegal elections that, that, you know, they can't go into the count for representation because it violates the rest of us in good states that run valid elections.
Yeah. And this is a tough thing. You know, a very prominent Oklahoma parliamentarian who you and I both know and have worked with, he's, you know, instructed me as chairman of the Rules Committee at political county conventions. He said, until you have an agreed upon credentials, all you have is a mob. So you've got to establish the credentials first. So they could not even do anything on January 6th until they established who is a credentialed member of the new Congress.
Correct. Well, that was basically established by the 6th because they didn't send anybody home. Nobody raised an objection.
It was established. But again, we're talking about in the old and perfect world.
Oh, in the old and perfect world, we have an illegal Congress right now. We have members in Congress who are there illegally. And so from the constitutional perspective, they're not Congress.
Okay, in our last week's episode, you said that, and we named some of them. We talked about Philadelphia because I believe it was a judge and the governor actually just by edict changed the election rules. In Georgia, the governor did consent decrees without the legislature. And then we had some other things, and that doesn't even have to do with the fraud in the counting of ballots.
No,
it's just in declaring rules that the legislature hasn't approved, right?
Correct. And this is the thing, is that when the discussion got away from you ran an improper election outside of the rules and got onto the fraud, now they can filibuster, basically say you have no proof, and it's going to take time to get proof, and that time goes past the electoral college count, and they just go ahead and accept all these illegal counts.
David Oldham constitutional argument on this has nothing to do with suitcases of ballots popping up or postal service trucks with ballots that were supposed to be mailed in, but there's no creases on the ballots. All of that stuff. We set that aside, and we just focus on what did the governor, the courts, the judges, the legislature, did they do it constitutionally? That's your argument.
Absolutely correct.
Okay.
Now the other stuff will come out with time, but it's going to take time for that to come out.
Gotcha.
And that will be things that will have to be looked into by the various state legislatures, so that they can plug those holes and figure out what needs to change so that never happens again. But when they're running these, and it was all because COVID. So when they were running these special rules and so forth, that in and of itself negated it. The fraud is icing on that cake.
Okay, so under that, you just threw out a very heavily Republican congressional delegation from Georgia, right? But so be it, because you're also throwing out Pennsylvania and what did you say, Michigan, I believe, and Wisconsin.
Michigan, and there probably were a lot of other states that had special rules that the legislature hadn't concocted, and therefore you don't have you have a lot of blue states as well, I believe. My brother reported to me that California did some of the same things that Pennsylvania and others did. Well, California gets thrown out. That means we don't have Nancy Pelosi or as Speaker of the House, because she's not allowed to be seated. They have to run another election and run it appropriately in order to get California seated, if that's correct.
Okay. Well, you've just uncovered a whole new narrative here of how this happens. And it's not because some people cheated and voted twice. It's because of how the state governing officials declared new rules for the election.
Correct. And actually, this isn't my information that I figured out. It was when I was elector, I made a friend of another elector down in Texas, and he taught it to me. So this has been in the 14th Amendment since 1865. And so, it's not new. It's been there, so we can all learn by it, but we've got to learn by it, because otherwise this is going to keep popping up and keep.
Now, what Ted Cruz and others, their strategy, and initially our own James Lankford agreed to work with Ted Cruz and others on this, was to simply call on those states to recanvass, revote, recertify in light of, or maybe just say, we screwed up this election. We don't have any electors to send.
Well, he wanted them to do it. They're not bound. They're not going to do that, obviously. As in 1876, the states sent in what they wanted to send in.
But what about Because I understand in Pennsylvania, the legislature actually did send a different slate than what the Secretary of State certified.
Well, the people that I've talked to, both in Congress and in the Senate, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, say there were no official alternate ballots presented.
Oh,
none. No, they were private. They were a Republican organization and so forth, but they were not the state legislatures. Irrespective of that, that's quite irrespective. The point is that we did have the legislatures of several states, including Pennsylvania, saying these things were run improperly. I mean, it was the Republicans in the state legislature within Pennsylvania that were suing and got turned down by the courts.
But Joseph Stalin is quoted as saying, "It's not who votes who counts; it's who counts the votes that counts."
Right. Well, and that's very true.
Well,
there was actually a fun story, and everybody should go watch the movie. The documentaries are much better because truth is always better than fiction. But it's the Battle of Athens. And in Athens, Tennessee, there was an actual gun battle over the ballot box in a crooked county. Think Boss Hogg, Dukes of Hazzard kind of stuff. After World War II, and the vets were coming back from World War II, were getting hassled, and they put up their own slate of candidates, and the bad guys were hogging the ballot box and we're going to count it in secret and so forth. So there was a gun battle. You should watch it because that's how important the count is.
That's called the Battle of Athens.
Battle of Athens.
All right, that's on our viewing list. So getting back to Stalin, Joseph Stalin, saying it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. So here's my point of that. You've got a member of the executive branch in each state, the Secretary of State, that actually gets to certify who won. But the legislature should have a voice in saying, hey, were our rules followed or not?
Correct.
And so I think maybe this is an area we could clarify better by federal statute. How we communicate to the states, with which body do we communicate with?
I'm not sure which you're asking, but
because if the Secretary of State, let's say Ratzenberger from Georgia, he was adamant, man, this was the most seamless, honest election we've ever had. I mean, he doubled down to no end. Right. But the Georgia legislature will tell you a different tune,
right?
Because they were run roughshod over.
Well, and I think this is where, quite frankly, the representatives from the offending states need to be telling on their own. This is the conundrum of our form of government. I mean, you have to be elected, but you have the duty to do what the Constitution says, irrespective of the desire of the electorate. You have your state you have to represent, yet you might have to send your own state's representatives home, or go home yourself until it can actually be done correctly. And you need to be the ones turning yourselves in. That's the way we know that it's being run fairly, is because people are actually honest.
Well, here's another one. And I don't know how much this, but I think it would have some effect. I talked to several members of our legislature, including some prominent senators, committee chairs. And I said, I would like to see Oklahoma put on our ballot that every presidential year, at the end of that election, on the first Monday after that Tuesday election in November, our legislature automatically meets for a special session just to pass a resolution stating affirmatively, yes, this election appears to have been run according to the statutes that we have put into law.
Okay.
Now, I don't know that it would have any teeth in decertifying anything, but I think it would be an added weight, or at least it would, because keep in mind, these lawmakers, their terms end at the end of that week, okay? So they got to move pretty fast.
Right.
Remember, you and I were fighting a thing with the governor making edicts that he waited until their terms ended at the end of that week. And then he called for a bunch of emergency orders, knowing that the legislature isn't going to meet again until early January.
Right.
And our friend Frank Urbanic got in on that. So I'm just kind of giving you a sense of this is the problem. And that's why I think rather than leaving up to the governor to call them into special session, no, I think the legislature needs to constitutionally have every fourth year, presidential year, they just meet to certify either this is a problem or they call for an investigation. And I think a resolution asking the attorney general to look into it.
Well, I think that's a very good idea. I think that needs to be left to the individual states.
Yes.
And I think that we as watchdogs can get to our various congressional delegations, our views on these things, as well as the state legislature looking into it. But I think you're absolutely right. The state legislature actually looking into each and every, especially the super important elections, that they are looking at these things and on a regular basis. Every 4 years is great. The presidential election is the biggest one we do every 4 years. So,
but David, when you were called to the Capitol as an elector back in 2016, you were elected by the Republicans, and then on the election day, when people voted for Trump, they were actually voting for you as an elector, as one of 7, right?
Correct.
If the Senate in the House, here in Oklahoma, had met in the second week in November, that would have given plenty of time for whether it's OSBI, the Attorney General's office, the state auditor's office, whoever, to do some kind of a forensic audit. Plenty of time before you would have been called to cast your presidential elector vote in mid-December.
Well, there's that. The real question is the state running a fair election? I mean, I think that's question number one. There's two questions here. Are they running an election according to the rules? Now, the rules may be bogus. The legislature may have bad rules, but is the election being run by those rules? Yes or no? Number two is, are those rules actually proper? And that's something we can look in at every single legislative session. Number three is, were the rules, or was there fraud? And that comes from everything from ballot harvesting to faking signatures and faking votes and things like that. And that is a third question that is a little more long-term, ongoing, because you may or may not be able to find these things. I mean, come on, there were audits done, there were recounts and audits done, and all of these flat blank paper that's never been folded, that was printed, not inked by hand. Those things were counted as legitimate on how many recounts? In Georgia, in Arizona, in other places. Okay, so we have a number of things that we have to look at. Whether or not you're going to catch number 3 before January, I don't know.
But, well, I think we can agree on this. Our Constitution gives, in the presidential election, gives the state one chance to do an honest election. And if they don't, then they just don't get to vote for president. That state is just removed from the Electoral College.
Well, and time removes there being any chance of a redo. Okay.
I don't think they can call for a presidential elector vote in December.
No, of course not. That's my point. Time. The constitutional provisions that it has to be on a particular day set by Congress. The fact that if it's done wrongly, there's no time to redo it, and there's no provision to redo it.
Right.
So therefore, The only thing is that your representation must be tossed, and you just don't get representation.
No, wait a minute. That's representation in the Electoral College.
In the Electoral College, or actually whatever that election was for. You're not to have, nobody's to have that representation. So the idea is to punish. Think of it like this, in the old dorms or boot camp or whatever, you punish the entire barracks to get the offenders to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So we, the people, don't get our representation in our state if our government doesn't do the right thing. Well, what does that do? That puts us on the spot crying for them to do the right thing so that we get our representation.
Okay.
Back.
Well, this goes to my last point then. Supposing that enough electors were disallowed from being a part of this so that no candidate reaches 270.
Correct.
Okay. Then constitutionally, what happens in Congress at that point?
What happens is the vote devolves to Congress. And so, in other words, so the president is to be chosen by the Electoral College via the states. When that cannot come to pass because there's no clear electoral majority, then what happens is Congress, it devolves to Congress, and specifically the House of Representatives chooses the president, and the Senate chooses the vice president. Now, for the vote, there must be a quorum of at least one member per state, and there must be a majority of states. Then, so in other words, one congressional member in the House and the Senate for their respective votes from each state. Each state only gets one vote. So it's up to each state to decide how they're going to do it. Usually goes by their majorities. And then they go off into their separate houses and take their votes. So it would be, who gets the most of 50, of more than 25 votes in Congress by state.
So even if, let's say, the California delegation, which is mostly Democrats, does a walkout, as long as one Republican, Darrell Issa, shows up, and he says, when they say California, he says present, then California is present just with that one guy, right?
Correct. And if the Democrats all stayed, walked out, and he cast his vote, California goes Republican. It's a Republican vote for California.
Okay. Now, let's say in 2000, Bush v. Gore, had Florida for some reason been set aside, then nobody would have been at 270.
Correct.
Then at that point, you could easily find yourself with a President Bush and a Vice President Al Gore.
You could, although there's no provision for it to not go that way even to today.
Okay.
But generally speaking, they want to keep the president and vice president within the same party. That's why they run together on platforms, and that was because of the problems that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had back in 1796. So we have good reason to not have president and vice president from different parties, because they'll be working at odds.
Okay, so then the other thing I want to ask on this is what happens now? Because I'm listening to Mike Lindell saying, hey, in a couple of weeks, he's going to have this thing about the data packets from all the ballot returns and that. And he's saying, man, the Supreme Court's going to vote 9-0 and unseat Biden and that. Now, it isn't that it's unconstitutional to take some kind of remedy. It's just the Constitution hasn't even dreamed up a scenario like what we might be dealing with here.
Well, we have a scenario that was wrongly handled, improperly handled in January.
Yeah.
We are now stuck with that decision. There is no constitutional provision. Remember, the Constitution is a constitution of expressed powers. There is no express power for the judiciary to overturn an election because of fraud or any other reason. It just doesn't exist.
Well, now let's clarify that. That would be violating the separation of powers, right?
Correct. It also violates the concept behind the Constitution, and specifically the 10th Amendment, because the 10th Amendment precludes any federal action that isn't expressly granted to them.
Okay.
That devolves to the states and the people.
Okay.
And
now help me out here. Our Constitution does enumerate certain powers to certain federal branches. It also gives, within the parameters of that, the opportunity for them to kind of flesh out the details in statutory law, as long as it's consistent and contained in that constitutional authority.
Right. Now, the Article 6 says that it's, or the First Amendment, the end of Section 8, not the First Amendment, the first article, end of Section 8 says that they have the power, Congress shall have the power to create laws to bring into effect this Constitution.
Yes.
So whatever it takes to enable and to actually affect the principles within the Constitution, the powers expressed in the Constitution, that's what's allowed by statute. Now, you have an improper election, and you can't go back and redo it, and you can't go back and necessarily say that Joe Biden had any part of it, because that hasn't been demonstrated yet either.
Yeah.
That he was actually aware of all of this fraud. That hasn't even been alleged. But you can impeach him. Yeah. And you can impeach him on grounds that he was illegally emplaced, and that he took office. Now that could be argued, but again, when you impeach and you try in the Senate, these are political decisions, and we don't have a Congress that's willing to go there now. And so what we have is, this is the problem with maybe perhaps the weakness that we as people who want to see the Constitution restored to its proper governance. That we need to talk about. Is there a place for for an amendment that kind of addresses these things that may or may not have been foreseen?
Let me spell that out. You got to get 65 votes to remove from office in the Senate. 65 out of the 100 possible seated lawmakers.
Correct.
So. And I don't think we've ever had a party have 60, but you would have to have a bipartisanship about that decision.
It would have to be bipartisan. And again, it's even a question as to whether you could impeach Joe Biden, because it's for high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's like, he's not even alleged to have actually committed any crimes. So it would be tough to do that. Again, the lesson was more about the fact that the 14th Amendment, Section 2, clearly addresses this. That was the answer. The answer was back in January. Nobody did the right thing. Nobody in Congress got up and said, look, the Constitution says.
Well, it was January 3rd we did the wrong thing, right?
Well, we did that. We did the wrong thing on January 3rd. We also did the wrong thing on January 6th.
Gotcha.
You're absolutely right. So both times, and both because of the Constitution, and nobody's arguing the Constitution. Even Ted Cruz is talking about all this subjective fraud stuff. And it's like, who knows where that's going to turn out.
Gotcha.
So,
gotcha. Well, we're running out of time. This has been a great two-part series as an inaugural launch of our More Perfect Union. Notice we didn't call it a perfect union, just more perfect than the last time. And what do you want to get into in upcoming episodes for subjects?
Well, we're going to get into a bunch of things, but we will definitely be dealing with the current crop of discriminatory practices. We're going to talk about vaccines and masks. The Supreme Court just ruled, or no, not the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice just said that private entities and government agencies can mandate vaccines, even though they are not approved by the FDA for use. So we're going to have to talk about that, because that's just dead wrong, and they don't even bother to go to the Constitution to come up with that stuff. So we'll be talking about that. We're going to cover a lot of different territory.
Sounds good. Well, folks, join us every weekend for a new launch of our show, Our More Perfect Union. This is a production of constitutionalgrounds.com with David Oldham, the founder. I'm David Van with Sooner Politics. We're glad to be a part of this effort to further understand, what does the Constitution really say? And what does it look like for us to actually follow it? And this is going to take a lifetime to master. And, David here thinks he knows more than me, and he probably does, but I still think he's got a lot to learn. Do you learn more every day?
Every single day.
Yeah. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. Dave, any last thoughts?
Hey, thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope to see you again next week.
All right. Have a good night, folks.
Good night.